The digital clock at Camp Blackwood bled red. 18 hours until disposal. These 12 heroes weren't men, but military working dogs scheduled for incineration as surplus property. The air reeked of diesel and the desperate barking of the condemned. Navy SEAL Jaxson Thorne stood before the cages, his own K9, Havoc, bristling with the shared rage. Among the doomed was Justice, the malnourished partner of Jax's fallen brother. A corrupt major demanded Jax leave, threatening his honors and pension. Jax didn't blink. He reached for the latch, knowing that opening these cages would make him a fugitive from the country he bled for. Jaxson Thorne didn't need an alarm clock. His body remembered the exact vibration of the world at 400 hours. A lingering ghost of pre-dawn raids and the silent tension of the Breitling on his wrist. He sat on the edge of a bed that felt too soft, in a room that smelled too much like laundry detergent and not enough like cordite. His hands, scarred and steady, moved with a mechanical grace as they reached for a worn leather collar. Beside the bed, a massive frame shifted. Havoc, a 60-pound German shepherd with a coat like burnt sienna, was already awake. He didn't bark, he didn't whine. He simply stood, his ears forward. His eyes locked onto Jax with the intensity of a soldier awaiting orders. This was their normal, the quiet, suffocating peace that followed 20 years of noise. Jax didn't just walk. He moved with the calculated economy of a man who had spent his life navigating minefields. Every morning began the same way, a slow, rhythmic check of Havoc's paws, looking for debris or heat, a ritual born from the dusty plains of Kandahar, where a pebble could cost a dog its life. Jax ran his thumb over the jagged scar on Havoc's left flank, a souvenir from a suicide vest that should have taken them both. To the world, they were retired. To the Navy, they were processed. But as Jax strapped on his boots, tightening the laces until they bit into his ankles, he knew the transition was a lie. You don't just turn off the warrior, you just find a quieter place to bleed. He grabbed his keys, the weight of his retired SEAL trident feeling like a lead weight in his pocket, and stepped out into the humid Virginia morning. The drive to Camp Blackwood was supposed to be a favor. A quick check on inventory, as Major Graves had put it over a dry, bureaucratic phone call. But as Jax's truck approached the perimeter fence, the air changed. The sweet scent of pine was strangled by the heavy, oily stench of diesel and the metallic tang of old blood. This wasn't a transition center. It was a graveyard with a gate. Jax felt Havoc's low, guttural growl resonate through the door panel before the dog even made a sound. Havoc knew. He smelled the fear before they even saw the cages. Jax gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning a ghostly white. He wasn't here for inventory. He was here because Elias Vance, his brother, his teammate, the man who died in Jax's arms, had left a hole in the world that no amount of metals could fill, and that hole led straight to this concrete hellscape. Jax stepped out of the truck, the heat of the Virginia sun slapping him in the face. He didn't wait for an escort. He didn't ask for permission. He simply walked toward the sound, a cacophony of desperate, high-pitched barking that sounded more like weeping than a warning. The logistics center was a maze of corrugated steel and chain-link fences, a place where the military hid the things it no longer wanted to pay for. As he moved deeper into the facility, he passed crates of rusted engine parts and piles of mothballed uniforms. Then he saw them. 12 cages, stacked too high in a corner where the sun didn't reach. 12 pairs of eyes, some clouded with age, others wide with a terror that no animal should ever know. These weren't surplus equipment. These were MWDs, military working dogs. These were the creatures that had cleared the paths, sniffed the bombs, and kept the watch while the men slept. Now they were waiting for the disposal truck. Jax felt a cold, sharp blade of anger twist in his gut. He noticed a digital clock mounted on the wall above the cages, its red numbers bleeding into the dim light. 18 hours remaining. 18 hours until the incineration order took effect. He walked to the first cage, a Belgian Malinois, its coat matted with filth, pressed its nose against the wire. Jax didn't flinch. He reached out and let the dog catch his scent, the scent of a handler, of a protector. The dog went silent, its tail giving a single, tentative wag. On the cage door, a laminated card read, Property number 882-Alpha. Status, surplus. Disposal. Method, controlled thermal reduction. Thermal reduction, Jax whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. They're calling it thermal reduction. He looked back at Havoc, who was standing at a rigid attention, his gaze fixed on a cage in the very back, half shrouded in shadow. There was something different about that last one. While the others paced or whimpered, the dog in the shadows sat perfectly still. It was a German shepherd, skeletal and scarred, its eyes fixed on Havoc with an expression of profound, soul-crushing recognition. Jax felt a shiver run down his spine. He stepped toward the shadow, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he approached, the light hit the dog's collar. It wasn't the standard issue nylon. It was a frayed bit of paracord, braided in a pattern Jax recognized instantly. The Vance knot, a signature Elias had used on all his gear. Jax's breath hitched. He looked at the dog's ear, looking for the ID tattoo. It wasn't there. Instead, there was a strange, jagged mark. A green cross with a serial number that didn't match any military database Jax had ever seen. S-00-Z. It wasn't a military ID, it was something else. A brand? A mark of a different kind of service? The dog didn't growl. It just looked at Jax, and in those hollow eyes Jax saw the last moment of Elias's life. He saw the fire, the sand, and the betrayal that had been whispered about but never proven. Justice, Jax breathed, his voice cracking. The dog's ears twitched. It leaned its head to the side, a mirror of the way Elias used to when he was trying to figure out a joke. Jax reached for the latch of the cage, his fingers trembling. This shouldn't be possible. Justice was supposed to have been KIA alongside Elias. The official report said the dog had been lost in the explosion. Yet here he was, labeled as surplus, scheduled for incineration in 18 hours. The open loop of Elias's death, the unanswered questions about the intel, the missing timeline of the extraction, suddenly felt like a noose tightening around Jax's neck. Suddenly, the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor groaned open. The sound of polished heels clicked against the concrete, a sharp, rhythmic tempo that broke the heavy silence of the kennel. A man in a pristine Class A uniform stepped into the light, his silver oak leaves shimmering with an offensive brightness. Major Richard Graves looked at the cages with the same detached interest one might give to a pile of scrap metal. He didn't look at the dogs. He didn't see the lives behind the wire. He only saw the paperwork. He looked toward Jax, a thin rehearsed smile spreading across his face. A smile that didn't reach his eyes, which remained as cold and hard as the concrete they stood upon. "Commander Thorne," Graves said, his voice smooth and devoid of any real warmth. "You're early for the auction. Or perhaps you're just here to say goodbye to the old guard." Graves gestured vaguely toward the cages, his hand lingering near the digital clock that continued its relentless countdown. Jax didn't move his hand from the latch of Justice's cage. He could feel the heat radiating from the dog's body, a living pulse that defied the Major's cold calculation. The tension in the room thickened, a physical weight that pressed against Jax's chest. He looked from Graves to the digital clock, then back to the skeletal dog behind the wire. The normal life he had tried to build was gone. He was back in the red zone. He was back in the fight, and this time he wasn't leaving anyone behind. "These aren't equipment, Major," Jax said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the low, dangerous rumble of a storm on the horizon. "And this isn't an auction. It's a crime." Graves's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed, the mask of bureaucracy slipping just enough to reveal the predatory intent underneath. He took a step forward, his shadow falling over Jax in the cage. The hair between them crackled with the kind of tension that usually preceded a gunshot. Jax knew that if he clicked this latch, if he took this step, there was no going back. He was a Navy SEAL, a man of honor, a man who followed the code. But as he looked at Justice, he realized that some codes are written in blood and some vows are more sacred than any rank. The countdown hit 17 hours and 59 minutes. The game was over. The war was just beginning. Jax's grip on the latch tightened. The metal was cold, biting into his palm. He looked Graves dead in the eye, seeing the reflection of his own defiance. He wasn't just here to save a dog. He was here to unearth a truth that had been buried in the sand of a foreign desert, a truth that Graves and the people behind him would kill to keep hidden. Every muscle in Jax's body coiled, ready to spring. Havoc sensed the shift, his body lowering into a tactical crouch, his eyes never leaving the Major's throat. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the diesel generators and the shallow, rhythmic breathing of 12 condemned heroes. Thorne didn't blink. He reached for the latch, knowing that opening these cages would make him a fugitive from the country he bled for. But he also knew that if he walked away now, he'd be leaving his soul behind in those cages. He took a breath, the scent of the coming storm filling his lungs, and prepared to break the world to save his brothers. The silence of the kennel didn't just break. It shattered. The clinical, rhythmic tap of Major Graves's finger against his clipboard was replaced by the sudden, piercing screech of a walkie-talkie. "Security to Sector 4. Unauthorized access at the disposal bay. Code Red." The voice was thin and metallic, a jarring contrast to the heavy, organic breathing of the dogs. Graves didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Jax. He just adjusted the cuffs of his pristine uniform, the silver oak leaves on his shoulders catching the harsh fluorescent light like the teeth of a predator. The air in the room, already thick with the scent of diesel and fear, suddenly felt pressurized, as if the oxygen had been sucked out to make room for the coming violence. Jax felt the familiar electric hum of adrenaline, the combat high he had spent 3 years trying to drown in coffee and morning runs, surge back into his veins with the force of a tidal wave. Jax's hand remained frozen on the latch of Justice's cage. The metal was cold, a biting, industrial chill that seemed to seep through his skin and settle into his bones. He looked down at Justice, the dog Elias had talked about in every letter home, the dog that was supposed to be a pile of ash in a valley north of Jalalabad. Justice's eyes weren't just clouded with age, they were wide, with a clarity that was terrifying. The dog wasn't looking at the Major or the door where the guards would inevitably appear. He was looking at Jax's hands. He was looking for the signal. Beside them, Havoc shifted into a low, predatory crouch, his hackles raised like a line of jagged glass along his spine. Havoc didn't growl anymore. He had entered the silent, lethal headspace of a working dog on target. The two of them were a mirror of the men they used to be, one standing, one waiting, both ready to burn the world down. "You're making a catastrophic error, Thorne," Graves said, his voice dropping into a register of practiced, bureaucratic calm that made Jax's skin crawl. The major took a slow step forward, his polished boots clicking on the concrete like a countdown. "You were a legend in the teams, a trident-wearing hero. Don't throw away a 20-year legacy, your pension, and your freedom for this, for property that has already been decommissioned. Look at that animal, Jaxson. Look at it. It's a ghost. It's a liability. We are simply finishing what the insurgency started." Graves gestured with his chin toward Justice, his expression one of bored pity. "The paperwork is signed. The furnace is preheating. In 18 hours, this entire facility will be empty, and you can go back to your quiet life in Virginia. Just take your hand off the latch." Jax didn't move. He felt the weight of his retired SEAL trident in his pocket, a piece of gold-plated metal that was supposed to represent the highest honors a man could achieve. At 50, he had seen enough men in suits use words like liability and property to justify the unforgivable. He thought of Elias's widow, Sarah, sitting in that small kitchen in Norfolk, clutching a folded flag and a letter that claimed her husband's body and his dog had been vaporized in the blast. Lies. The official report had been a closed loop, a neat little story that allowed the Navy to move on. But looking at Justice, seeing that Vance knot paracord collar and the jagged, unofficial S-00-Z brand on his ear, the loop didn't just open, it tore wide. Justice wasn't just left behind. He was stolen. He was filtered through a shadow system, a dark site program that used MWDs for things no one wanted on a public ledger. "He died for you," Jax whispered, his voice vibrating with a depth of rage that surprised even him. Elias stayed in that kill zone to make sure the extraction bird had a clear LZ. "And you told us justice was KIA. You told his family there was nothing left to bury." Jax's grip on the latch tightened until the metal groaned. The internal reaction was a slow burn realization of the ultimate betrayal. For a man who had dedicated his life to the concept of never leave a man behind, this wasn't just a regulatory oversight. It was a desecration of the oath. The empathy he felt for the skeletal dog in front of him was indistinguishable from the grief he felt for his fallen brother. They were both victims of a machine that calculated the value of a soul in cents and cents alone. "The world is a complicated place, Commander," Graves replied, his eyes narrowing. "Some assets are more valuable in the shadows, but justice has outlived his usefulness. Whatever secrets Elias Vance thought he was protecting, they died with him. This dog is just a loose thread, and I am here to snip it." The major's hand moved toward his holster, not to draw, but as a subtle reminder of the power he held. "Last warning, Thorne. Step away from the cage." At that moment, the heavy steel doors at the end of the corridor blew open with a violent clang. 4 security contractors in tactical gear, carrying suppressed rifles, flooded into the kennel. They didn't move like regular MPs. They moved with the professional fluidity of private military contractors. They took up flanking positions, their weapons held at a low ready, lasers dancing across the concrete floor like flickers of red blood. The barking of the 12 dogs reached a fever pitch, a wall of sound that vibrated the very air. But Jax only heard the ticking of that digital clock. 17 hours and 57 minutes. The normal life Graves promised was a cage of its own, built on silence and complicity. Jax looked at Havoc. In the dog's eyes, he saw the reflection of every night they had spent in the dirt, every door they had kicked, every brother they had lost. There was no hesitation there. there was only the mission. Jax realized then that Graves was right about one thing. Justice was a loose thread, but pulling a loose thread is how you unravel a whole suit. By revealing justice was alive, Jax wasn't just saving a dog. He was reopening the investigation into the mission that killed his best friend. The S-00-ZO wasn't a military marking. It was a contractor's stamp. It was the key to a truth that went higher than a major in a Virginia kennel. "I won't tell you again," Graves said, his voice now sharp and jagged. "Step away." Jax felt a strange, cold peace descend over him. It was the same feeling he had before a halo jump, the moment where the door opens and the only way out is down. He looked at the guards, then back at Graves. He thought about the people who would watch this, the people who had served, who had lost, who knew what it felt like to be told their sacrifice was surplus. He wasn't doing this for the medals. He wasn't doing it for the pension. He was doing it because if he walked away, he would be the one who was dead. "You call them property, Major," Jax said, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "But in my world, we have a different word for them. We call them brothers." With a sudden, violent wrench, Jax didn't just lift the latch. He kicked the entire cage door. The old rusted hinges screamed as the steel gave way under the force of a man who had nothing left to lose. The sound was like a gunshot in the cramped space. Before the guards could even register the movement, Jax reached in and grabbed Justice by the paracord collar, pulling the frail dog toward him just as Havoc launched himself forward. Not to attack, not yet, but to create a wall of muscle and fur between his handler and the rifles. In those few seconds, the world tilted. The normal was gone forever. The law was a memory. The red numbers on the clock seemed to pulse with a new urgency. Jax felt the sharp, metallic tang of the air, the scent of a coming storm. And he knew that once he crossed this threshold, there was no bridge back to the man he was yesterday. He looked at the 11 other cages, at the 22 pairs of eyes that were now silent, watching him with a hope that was heavier than any armor. He wasn't just taking justice. He was taking all of them. Graves's face contorted, the mask of the professional officer finally slipping to reveal the panicked man underneath. "Kill the dogs," he barked at the guards. "Take Thorne into custody. Use whatever force is necessary." Jax didn't wait for the trigger pull. He threw his weight against the next cage, and the next, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the doors opening sounding like a drum roll for the end of the world. As the first of the 12 surplus heroes stepped out onto the concrete, their paws clicking in a unified, terrifying cadence, Jaxson Thorne knew his life as a citizen was over, and his life as a fugitive had begun. He looked at the Major, the skeletal dog pressed against his side, and felt the final heavy snap of the social contract breaking. "Courage walks on 2 legs and 4, he whispered, mostly to himself as the first laser sight settled on his chest. He didn't blink, he didn't retreat. He simply stepped into the fire, knowing that from this moment on, the only way home was through the men who had betrayed him. Jaxson Thorne's world had narrowed to the space between 2 flickering kerosene lamps and the relentless thrum of rain against a rusted tin roof. The cabin, a derelict hunting shack deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, smelled of wet pine and the copper tang of old blood. He sat on the floor back against a drafty log wall, legs stretched out in a way that made his knees scream from years of jump shocks and mountain rugs. At 52, the adrenaline had curdled, leaving only the cold weight of reality. He wasn't a commander anymore. He was a man who had stolen government property, assaulted federal contractors, and vanished into the timber. In the eyes of the country he'd bled for, Jaxson Thorne was now a domestic fugitive. Beside him, Havoc lay in an uneasy curl, ears twitching toward the snap of branches outside. The shepherd's coat was matted with mud, his breathing shallow, but it was the other dog, the ghost, that commanded Jax's focus. Justice lay on a pile of moth-eaten wool blankets, his skeletal frame trembling with a fever that burned from the inside out. Jax reached into his tactical med kit, pulling a needle and a bag of saline he'd snatched from the kennel. His hands, once steady enough to thread a needle in a sandstorm, were shaking. He watched the lamplight dance over the S-00-ZD brand on Justice's ear, a jagged scar representing a betrayal deeper than any bullet wound. To the men in suits, Justice was a decommissioned asset. To Jax, this dog was the last living piece of Elias Vance, the man who had pulled Jax from a burning HMMWV in Baghdad. Watching Justice struggle for breath was like watching Elias die again, but this time, the death was slow and quiet. There were no mortars, only the indifferent drip of rainwater into a plastic bucket. Jax adjusted the IV line, his eyes burning. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Major Graves' face, a mask of bureaucratic indifference, and felt the crushing weight of 20 years of service that now felt like a transaction where he'd been cheated. Jax looked at his reflection in a cracked piece of glass leaning against the fireplace. He saw a man he didn't recognize, hollowed-out eyes, a salt-and-pepper beard, and deep lines around a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. For anyone over 50, this was the mirror of the soul. The moment you realize the institutions you built your life upon have no place for you once your utility is spent. You give them your youth and your health, and in return, they give you a thermal reduction order for those who carried you through the dark. A surge of bitterness tasted like ash in his mouth. He'd followed the code, loyalty, duty, honor, only to find that the men at the top viewed those words as marketing slogans. "Is this it, Elias?" Jax whispered, his voice cracking. "Did we do all that just to end up hiding in the dirt like thieves?" There was no answer. He had spent his life in a world of absolute orders, but now the mission was a blur of gray. He was a fugitive. His bank accounts would be frozen by morning. His name would be smeared in every briefing. And everything he'd worked for, the medals, the reputation, was gone. He had traded a comfortable life for a dying dog and a truth no one wanted to hear. Loneliness wasn't a concept. It was a physical pressure against his ribs, making it hard to draw air. He thought of Sarah, Elias's widow, and the phone calls he couldn't make. The isolation was absolute. Justice let out a low, guttural whine, legs paddling weakly as if running through a dream. Jax leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the dog's snout. "Easy, boy. I'm not leaving you behind." But the doubt crept in like the cold air through the wall cracks. Who was he to make such a promise? He was just one man with a failing body and stolen supplies. He felt his faith, not just in the military but in the order of the universe, slipping away. He had prayed for Justice's safety, but in the stillness it felt like those prayers had washed away with the rain. If there was a God, why was he letting this soldier rot in a shack while traitors slept in silk? The physical pain in his back flared, a sharp, white-hot needle of sciatica that blurred his vision. He reached for ibuprofen, then stopped. He didn't want the numbness. He wanted the pain because it was the only thing that felt honest. He looked at Havoc, who was staring with an intensity that felt like judgment. Havoc knew. Dogs always knew when their handler's center was fraying. Jax realized that if he broke, the dogs would break. But he was so tired. He was tired of being the strong one, the one who navigated the minefields, He wanted to lay his head down. He wanted to admit that maybe Graves was right, that fighting the system was a self-destructive act of vanity. He pulled his retired SEAL trident from his pocket, the gold finish dulled by shadows. He remembered the day he'd earned it, the pride of belonging to something eternal. Now, it felt like a heavy piece of metal, a symbol of a contract broken by the other side. He thought of the brothers no longer here, those whose names were being erased by people like Graves. He felt the weight of 50 years of doing the right thing, and wondering if the road to hell was paved with blind obedience. The silence was deafening, broken only by the whistling wind and the clicking of Justice's teeth as a chill took him. Jax laid Justice's head in his lap, stroking the scarred ears. This was the bottom. No backup was coming. No Q section would drop from a helicopter. There was no secret plan, no higher authority to appeal to. He was a man without a country, without a mission, and nearly out of hope. He sat there, cradling the dying legacy of his best friend, and let the first tear fall into the dog's fur. It was a moment of absolute surrender to the darkness, a recognition that the world was more cruel than he had believed. He felt the empty space where his purpose used to be, a void being filled with the cold realization that some battles are lost before they begin. Courage wasn't just about the charge. It was about standing still when everything turned to dust. As the kerosene lamps flickered and died, leaving them in a pitch-black void, the rain intensified into a rhythmic drumming that counted down the final minutes. Jax closed his eyes, braced for the end. The sound of the door being kicked in, or the last breath leaving Justice's lungs. He was ready for the dark. He was ready for the peace of having nothing left to lose. He whispered the mantra that had lost its power. Courage walks on 2 legs and 4. But the words felt like a eulogy rather than a battle cry. He lay there in the dark, a broken warrior in a broken room, waiting for the silence to become permanent. But then, in the absolute heart of the darkness, something happened. The darkness in the shack was absolute, a heavy, suffocating shroud that felt less like an absence of light and more like a presence of despair. Jaxson Thorne sat motionless, his back pressed against the splintered logs, feeling the biting mountain cold seep into the very marrow of his bones. In his lap, Justice's head was a feather-light weight, the skeletal dog's breathing so faint it barely stirred the dust on Jax's trousers. Beside them, Havoc remained a silent sentinel, his muscular frame a low shadow that vibrated with a suppressed, anxious energy. For hours, Jax had existed in this void, haunted by the digital ghost of Major Graves's voice and the crushing reality of his own obsolescence. He felt like a man who had survived 100 storms only to drown in a puddle of his own making. The retirement he had earned, the peace he had sought, it was all ash. He was a fugitive now, a thief of property, a man whose 20-year legacy had been reduced to a target on a briefing slate. Grief is a strange guest. It doesn't just sit with you, it redecorates your mind with your failures. Jax thought of every mission where the objective had been prioritized over the soul. He thought of Elias Vance, the brother who had saved him in a burning Humvee, only to be left behind in a different kind of fire. The never leave a man behind oath felt like a hollow mockery in the pitch-black room. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the sharp edges of his gold SEAL trident. He had carried that piece of metal with a religious fervor, a symbol of a covenant that he now realized had been broken by the very men who had commissioned it. He felt a tear, hot and heavy, track through the grime on his cheek. It wasn't just for Elias. It wasn't just for justice. It was for the man he used to be, the one who believed the world had a moral floor. Right now, it felt like the floor had dropped out, leaving him suspended in a bottomless, indifferent sky. Then the rhythm of the world began to shift. The rain, which had been a relentless, drumming assault on the tin roof, suddenly tapered off into a soft, melodic patter. The violent wind died down to a whisper, and for the first time since they had fled the kennel, the mountain went silent. It was a vacuum of sound that demanded attention. Jax didn't move, but his senses, honed by decades of operating in the dead space between life and death, began to sharpen. The air in the shack, previously thick with the scent of damp wool and old blood, suddenly felt fresh. It carried the scent of wet pine needles and the sharp, ozone-rich tang of a passing storm. It was the scent of a new day, even if the eyes couldn't see it yet. Jax looked down at Justice. In the pre-dawn gray that was slowly beginning to bleed through the cracks in the walls, the dog's eyes were open. They weren't clouded with the milky haze of death anymore. They were clear, reflecting a tiny pinprick of light that shouldn't have been there. Justice wasn't looking at the door, or at Havoc. He was looking directly at Jax. There was no fear in that gaze, only a profound, ancient recognition. It was as if the dog was waiting for him to catch up, waiting for the handler to remember the mission. Justice let out a low, soft huff. Not a whine of pain, but a signal. A comm check from a fellow soldier. At that exact moment, a single, sharp ray of light, the first beam of the rising sun, pierced through a narrow gap in the roof. It was a precise golden needle of fire that cut through the shadows. It didn't illuminate the room. It illuminated a specific point. The light hit the S-Zero-Z brand on Justice's ear. Under the brilliance of the morning sun, the jagged scar seemed to transform. Jax leaned in, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs with a new, rhythmic purpose. In the harsh, clinical light of the kennel, the marking had looked like a random contractor's stamp. But here, bathed in the warmth of the dawn, Jax saw the truth. The S-00-Z wasn't a brand. It was a cipher. Jax's fingers, which had been shaking with fatigue and cold, suddenly became steady. He reached out and gently turned Justice's ear, his eyes scanning the skin surrounding the scar. Under the magnification of the direct sunlight, he saw what he had missed in the dark. Tiny, microscopic dots tattooed into the skin, hidden within the serifs of the letters. These weren't the markings of a contractor. They were the markings of a dead drop specialist. Elias Vance hadn't just been a communications guy. He was the primary architect of the covert signal network for the entire sector. He was a man who lived and breathed in code. "Yo, brilliance, bastard," Jax whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden surging hope. He didn't just see the marks. He remembered the reason for them. He remembered the long nights in the barracks when Elias would sit with a paracord jig, weaving what he called the Vance knot. It was a complex, multi-layered weave that Elias joked could hold a secret better than a safe. Jax looked at the paracord collar still around Justice's neck. It was frayed and muddy, but the weave was distinct. He realized then that the S00Z wasn't a label for the dog. It was an index. S00 Zulu. It was a timestamp and a location code for a digital cache. Elias knew they were coming for him. He knew Justice might be the only thing that survived the blast. He hadn't just saved his dog, he had turned his dog into a living, breathing hard drive. A surge of electricity, more potent than any adrenaline high Jax had ever experienced, flooded his system. The physical pain in his back didn't disappear, but it became secondary, a distant background noise to the absolute clarity of the moment. He wasn't a fugitive protecting a dying animal. He was an operator in possession of the most critical piece of intelligence in the Virginia Shadow System. The realization hit him with the force of a breaching charge. Graves wasn't trying to euthanize Justice because he was surplus. He was trying to erase the only evidence of the treason that had cost Elias his life. Justice's tail gave a single, weak thump against the wool blanket. Tit-tit-tit. It was the sound of a brother coming back from the brink. Jax stood up. The movement was slow, his joints popping like dry wood, but the heaviness in his soul had evaporated. He felt light. He felt dangerous. He looked at the gold trident in his hand once more. It was no longer a dead symbol of a broken past. It was a reminder of the oath he had taken to the men beside him, not the men above him. He had been looking for a reason to keep fighting, a why, to justify the carnage he had wrought at the kennel. Now, he had it. He had the truth. And in his world, the truth wasn't something you whispered. It was something you used to burn down the lies. "Pack it up, Havoc," Jax said, his voice now a low command deck rumble. The shepherd was on his feet instantly, ears forward, tail high. The dog sensed the change. The alpha was back. The hesitation that had crippled Jax for the last 48 hours was gone, replaced by the linear focus of a predator on the scent. He began to move with a renewed clinical efficiency, packing the med kit and securing the cabin. He didn't look like a man at the end of his rope anymore. He looked like a man who'd just found the rope and was starting to climb. He knelt beside Justice and gently lifted the dog into a specialized carry harness he had rigged from his tactical vest. "We're going home, Justice," he whispered. "Maybe not the home we thought, but the home Elias wanted for us. We're going to tell his story." The rhythm of the scene had changed completely. The long, weighted sentences of the night had given way to the short, punchy cadence of the mission. Check the perimeter, secure the asset, move to the extraction point. Every action was a declaration of war. Jax stepped to the door of the shack and kicked it open. The morning light didn't just enter. It flooded the space, washing away the shadows of the S-00-Z and the fear of the dark. Outside, the mountain was a masterpiece of golden green, the mist rising from the valley like the smoke of a battle already won. Jax looked at the trail ahead. A steep, treacherous descent that would lead them back into the teeth of the men hunting them. He didn't care about the frozen bank accounts or the warrants. He cared about the weight on his back and the dog at his side. He adjusted the straps of the harness, feeling the warmth of justice against his spine. Courage wasn't the absence of the dark. It was the ability to carry the light through it. "Courage walks on 2 legs and 4, Jax said. The tagline no longer a prayer, but a battle cry. As they stepped out onto the ridge, the first sound of a distant, low-thrumming engine reached his ears. It wasn't a civilian vehicle. It was the heavy, rhythmic beat of a Blackhawk's rotors, vibrating the air miles away. They were coming for him. They had tracked the signal or the logic of his flight path. Jaxson Thorne didn't duck. He didn't hide. He looked toward the sound, a cold, hard smile touching his lips for the first time in years. They thought they were hunting a broken man and a dying dog. They didn't realize they had just given a Navy SEAL a reason to start the war. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, encrypted handheld radio he'd taken from the disposal bay. He didn't turn it on yet, but he knew exactly which frequency he was going to hit. He had the key now. He had the code. And the world was about to find out that decommissioned was just another word for unleashed. Jaxson took the first step down the mountain, his eyes locked on the horizon, where the sun was now a blinding, magnificent fire. The hunt was over. The counterstrike had begun. Just as the shadow of the helicopter appeared on the far ridge, Jax turned to Havoc and gave the signal to move. Let's give them a truth they can't bury. Jaxson Thorne didn't just move, he operated. The lethargy of the night had been stripped away, replaced by the cold, linear focus of a man who had spent 3 decades navigating dead zones. He tightened the straps of the makeshift harness, feeling the weight of justice pulling against his traps, a heavy rhythmic burden that felt more like a battery than an anchor. Beside him, Havoc was a silent shadow, his ears swiveling to catch the subsonic thrum of the approaching Blackhawk. The dog sensed the shift. The Alpha was no longer mourning. The Alpha was hunting. "Havoc, point," Jax whispered. He didn't mean for the dog to just lead, he meant for him to clear the path. Havoc surged forward, a low-slung blur of fur and muscle weaving through the thick mountain rhododendrons. Every movement Jax made was calibrated to minimize his thermal signature against the cool dampness of the ridge. He worked the mill shadows, those pockets of darkness under the thickest canopy where the morning sun couldn't reach. His eyes scanned the terrain in 3-second intervals, identifying escape funnels, concealment nodes, and fields of fire. His sciatica was a screaming, white-hot needle in his back, but he didn't fight the pain, he weaponized it. He used the sharp electric jolts to stay grounded, to keep his brain from drifting into the fog of the past. The pain was the only thing that felt honest. They crested the first secondary ridge when a Widowmaker surveillance drone arrived. It was a carbon fiber insect, humming 10 feet above the canopy, searching for the infrared glow of a human heart. Jax didn't dive for cover. Instead, he simply became the ground. He sank into the wet pine needles, pulling the dogs into a tight cluster. He pulled a silver-lined thermal tarp from his pack and draped it over himself and the dogs. Under the tarp, the air became hot and recycled, heavy with the scent of wet pine, Justice's feverish breath, and Havoc's musk. Through a tiny gap, Jax watched the drone. It hovered, its gimbal clicking as it processed the void he had created. It was a digital standoff. Major Graves was using an algorithm, and algorithms had no room for mercy or human error. Jax reached into his pocket and pulled out the encrypted handheld radio. He didn't power it on yet. Instead, he used his multi-tool to scrape the contacts. S-00-Z, he muttered, racing through the logic of the code Elias Vance had left on Justice's ear. Zulu, Timegate, Sector 0. He realized Justice wasn't just a hard drive. He was a mobile key. The data Elias had hidden wouldn't unlock until the dog was within range of a specific repeater node. Elias had built a digital ghost that required a physical presence to summon. It was the ultimate failsafe for a soldier who knew he was being hunted. The drone dipped lower, the downdraft shaking the branches. Havoc let out a low vibration in his chest, a warning. Jax pressed a steadying hand against the dog's ribcage. Hold. Suddenly, a heat bloom erupted 300 yards back at the shack. His trap had sprung. The kerosene and battery scrap had created a false positive. The drone zipped away, a streak of black plastic chasing a lie. Jax shed the tarp. Move, now. They hit the steep grade of the ridge, Jax's boots digging into loose shale. Every step was a battle against gravity and the 80 pounds of dog and gear. Sweat stung his eyes, and the grit of the mountain was in his teeth. A flash of memory hit him, a pattern interrupt as vivid as a flare. Fallujah, 2011. Elias Vance was sitting on a plastic crate, fingers dancing through a tangled mess of fiber optic cables. "You worry too much about the gun, Jax," Elias had said, flashing a reckless grin. The gun is a door knocker. The real war? It's in the silence between the ones and zeros. You hide a truth in a signal, and it lives forever, even after the signalman has been erased. Elias had ruffled the ears of a young Malinois puppy, the first justice. A dog's memory, that's the only vault the agency can't hack. Remember that. Back in the present, Jax's boots hit granite. The memory wasn't a distraction. It was the final piece of the tactical puzzle. He wasn't running. He was a courier for the dead. He reached the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley. 3 black SUVs were snaking along the highway. These weren't government vehicles. They were private contractors hired by Graves. Graves was playing outside the wire. Jax clicked the radio to life. The screen buzzed a ghostly blue. He didn't transmit. He tuned. He searched for the ghost frequency, the invisible mesh Elias used for covert signals. Static, a rhythmic pulse. It was a heartbeat. The S-00-Z index was beginning to ping against the secure network of the SUVs. Elias had rigged the system so the very men hunting the dog would provide the signal bridge needed to download the data. It was tactical genius. It was Elias. "We're the bait boys," Jax said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He didn't look like an aging veteran anymore. He looked like the Team 3 commander. He descended the vertical face of the ridge, using paracord to lower Justice. His muscles screamed with the effort, but he ignored it. He was operating on high-octane adrenaline and spite. Every drop of sweat was a cold refusal to surrender. He reached the tree line, 200 yards from the asphalt. He could smell the exhaust of the lead vehicle. He was in the kill zone. But Jax felt a terrifying calm. He was a shadow among shadows, his matte black knife in one hand and the radio in the other. The Blackhawk roared overhead, its searchlight cutting a violent scar through the timber. The thermal camera was searching for his life. Jax looked at Justice, tucked safely behind a log with Havoc. The shepherd's ears were back, his body coiled. Justice's eyes were clear, watching Jax with a soldier's faith. Jax turned back to the road. The lead SUV was 100 yards away. The radio in his hand began to vibrate with the force of the incoming transmission. The data transfer was at 40%. He needed them to slow down. He needed time. He was a man with a dying dog and a mission that had just become historical. He stepped toward the edge of the tree line, the roar of the chopper and the engines blending into a single wall of sound. He had the key, the courage, and the truth. But as the shadow of the second Blackhawk appeared over the far ridge, its nose dipping as it locked weapon systems onto his coordinates, Jax felt the weight of the universe pressing down again. The counter-strike had begun, but the odds were still 1,000 to 1. Liu, Ju, Nai, Ko, Ju, Kong. Will this be enough? The air is a pressurized soup of JP-8 kerosene, and the metallic tang of overheated radiators, vibrating with the percussion of twin T700-G EE-701D engines. Jaxson Thorne lies low, his belly pressed into the damp, unforgiving earth, while grit and alkaline dust coat his tongue with the taste of copper and the finality of a career built on silence. To his left, Justice, the Belgian Malinois, shivers with a violence that defies the night, his breath a wet, whistling sound that tears at Jackson's focus. On the dog's ear, the bioluminescent glow of the S00Z code pulses, a soft violet light synced to the wireless bridge emitting from the hardened SUV 10 yards away. Justice is a biological vessel for 3 terabytes of encrypted state secrets, leaking life from a shrapnel wound to the haunch. Standing as a motionless sentinel is Havoc, the veteran shepherd, whose predatory stillness monitors the tree line where muzzle flashes strobe against the darkness. Havoc watches for the metallic clatter of reloading AK-74s and the heavy thrum of approaching armor as the tactical window collapses. Jackson's wrist gauntlet chirps, the OLED screen flashing a cold blue light. Upload, progress, 84%. A voice crackles in his bone conduction headset with the clinical detachment of a man watching a map from 1,000 miles away. Sterling, VO. Thorne, the window is closed. D-72S and motorized infantry are moving on your position. You have 90 seconds before those Blackhawks are forced to RTB. If you aren't on that bird when it lifts, you don't exist. Leave the asset and move now. Jaxson doesn't answer. He looks at Justice, whose eyes are glazed with shock but fixed on Jaxson with absolute trust. It is the kind of gaze that expects salvation because it was promised in the quiet hours of training. The image triggers a jagged memory. 10 years ago in Kandahar, Jaxson abandoned his teammate Elias to secure a priority hard drive as their extraction compound crumbled. He ignored the man's desperate pleas and watched from the air as the building roared into fire. The mission was a success, but Jaxson has lived as a ghost ever since, his record clean and his soul scorched. The memory hits him like a physical blow until the SUV takes a direct hit from an RPG. The chassis rocks violently, groaning under the kinetic impact, and the signal bridge light on the roof begins to flicker into a jagged red. Upload status. Signal interference. Stalled. Sterling, V. Oh, the bridge is compromised and the recovery is botched. We're initiating scorched earth to level the tree line in 3 minutes. Get to the extraction point now or be caught in the blast. Leave the dog. We'll wipe your record and you go home a hero. Move. Jaxson looks at the Blackhawk, where a crew chief waves a chemical light in desperate arcs. The winch cable snakes down a steel umbilical cord offering a return. All it costs is one asset left to die in the dirt. His fingers reach for the carabiner on his harness, ready to hook into the line and leave Justice behind. He can see a future where his file is wiped and his failures are forgotten, but his hand freezes. The Malinois whimpers, a fragile sound of vulnerability that cuts through the roar of the engines. Havoc nudges Jackson's hand with a wet nose, his golden eyes filled with an ancient, wordless question. Jaxson knows the tactical math. To fix the signal, he must leave cover, climb the exposed vehicle, and hold the connection manually. He will be a lone silhouette against the moon, a perfect target for every rifle in the woods. Jaxson Thorne doesn't speak. He unclips the carabiner and tosses it into the dirt, ripping the headset off his ear. He lunges toward the smoking SUV as bullets snap through the air with the distinctive crack snap of supersonic rounds. He scrambles up the hood, boots slipping on a mixture of spilled coolant and hydraulic oil. He grabs the mangled antenna. The metal is white-hot, searing his palms instantly. The pain radiates up his arm at agonizing waves, but he forces the lead back into the socket, his muscles screaming. On his wrist, the red bar turns a steady, glowing blue. 91%, 95%. The enemy infantry has reached the edge of the clearing. A hail of 7.62mm rounds hammers into the SUV's armored side like a frantic hammer on a coffin. Jaxson is completely exposed. He feels a sharp, hot iron poke his shoulder, a graze. Then another white-hot sting in his thigh. He doesn't flinch, locking his gaze on Justice, who is tucked behind a fallen log and protected by the massive, loyal body of Havoc, 98%. The Blackhawk pilot pulls up, the bird beginning to rise as the downdraft kicks up a choking cyclone of debris. The helicopter, the extraction, the clean life, it all drifts upward, out of reach. Jaxson feels the earth-shaking vibration of the T-72 tank's main gun firing. He doesn't look at the shell, he looks at the dog. 100%. Upload complete. Encryption secured. In one fluid, violent motion, Jaxson rolls off the roof of the SUV just as the tank shell impacts the engine block. The explosion is a wall of orange fire and jagged shrapnel that hurls Jaxson through the air. He hits the ground hard, the world spinning into a gray haze. His ears are ringing with a high-pitched, lonely whine that drowns out the sounds of the battle. He coughs, spitting out blood as he tries to move his legs. They work, but they feel heavy, like lead pipes dragging through the mud. He looks up through the thick haze of oily smoke to see the Blackhawks are gone. He is alone in the center of a designated kill zone with the scorched earth strike inbound. He has lost his exit, his career, and the official mission. A wet tongue licks his bloodied cheek. Justice is there, dragging his wounded hind leg, his tail giving a weak, tentative wag. Havoc stands over them both, his hackles raised in defiance as he faces the approaching shadows of the enemy. Jaxson reaches out, his burnt, trembling hand burying his fingers in Justice's thick fur. The dog leans into him, the warmth of a living heart beating against Jackson's palm. For the first time in a decade, the weight of Elias is gone. He isn't a ghost of the state anymore. He is a protector. The sound of incoming jet engines screams from the stratosphere, the scorched earth strike. Jaxson pulls the dogs into the deep hollow of a massive, ancient oak tree's roots, wrapping his body around them as a shield of flesh and Kevlar. He closes his eyes and smells the scent of wet fur, iron-rich earth, and loyalty. It is a better smell than kerosene. The horizon turns a blinding, holy white as the first missiles find their marks. The ground heaves and the world ends in fire, but in the center of the storm, Jaxson Thorne holds tight to the only mission that ever truly mattered. Courage walks on 2 legs and 4, and for the first time in his life, Jaxson isn't running away. He is home. The silence of the big sky country wasn't like the silence of the tactical world. In the shadows of his former life, silence was a vacuum, a terrifying void where the absence of sound meant either the enemy was waiting or you were already dead. But here, on the 300-acre stretch of timber and tall grass he'd named the Sentinel's Rest, a silence had a texture. It was the sound of wind filtering through lodgepole pines, the distant rush of a meltwater creek, and the rhythmic, steady breathing of 2 massive dogs sprawled across a porch made of hand-hewn cedar. Jaxson Thorne sat in a heavy Adirondack chair, his hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of coffee. The heat seeped through the ceramic, pressing against the thick, silvered ridges of scar tissue that crisscrossed his palms. Those scars were a permanent map of the night he'd climbed the electrified perimeter at Camp Blackwood, the night he'd pulled Justice through the wire and held on as the high-voltage current tried to cook him alive. The doctors had told him he might lose the use of his fingers, but they hadn't accounted for a man who had nothing left but his grip. Now, those palms were a badge. They were the price of admission to a life where he no longer had to hide in the periphery of society. He looked at the skin, pebbled and tough, and felt a strange sense of pride. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man with a history written in fire and flesh. The world had changed since that final, frantic data upload from the server room. When Jaxson had hit the transmit key, he hadn't just released evidence of a rogue officer's cruelty. He had dismantled a philosophy, the surplus property program, which had classified retired K-9s as nothing more than depreciated equipment to be liquidated, had been vaporized by the sheer heat of public outrage. Major Graves hadn't just been relieved of duty, The federal investigation that followed had peeled back layers of corruption that went far deeper than a few mistreated dogs. Graves was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security military prison. His legacy, not one of tactical brilliance, but of profound cowardice. The man who had tried to play God with the lives of the brave was now just a number in a cell, stripped of his rank, his medals, and his dignity. But the victory wasn't just in the downfall of a villain. It was in the survival of the innocent. The other 11 dogs, the surplus Jaxson had refused to leave behind, weren't just saved, they were honored. Following the Thorne Justice Act, which had been fast-tracked through Congress in a rare moment of bipartisan unity, every one of those dogs had been retired with full honors. 6 of them had found homes with the families of the fallen handlers they had served alongside. 4 were working as therapy animals for veterans with severe PTSD, and the last, a stubborn, one-eared Belgian Malinois named Cinder, who had been too traumatized for standard adoption, lived right here on the ranch, currently patrolling the perimeter of the goat pen with a sense of purpose that no kennel could ever provide. Jaxson set his mug down and whistled low. A shadow shifted on the porch. Justice, once a skeletal creature with dull fur and ribs that told a story of starvation, rose with a fluidity that was beautiful to behold. He was 75 pounds of solid muscle now, his coat gleaming like polished onyx in the afternoon sun. There was no limp in his stride, no fear in his eyes. He crossed the porch and rested his heavy head on Jackson's knee, his tail thumping rhythmically against the wood. Beside him, Havoc, the veteran who had started this journey with Jaxson, gave a wide-toothy yawn before trotting over to join the huddle. "You're looking good today, buddy," Jaxson murmured, his voice thick with a warmth he hadn't known he possessed 6 months ago. He rubbed Justice behind the ears, his scarred palms finding the familiar soft spots. Jaxson stood up, the movement easy and unhurried. He walked down the porch steps toward the small alpine lake that sat at the heart of the property. The water was a perfect mirror, reflecting the jagged peaks of the Bridger Range. As he stood at the water's edge, Justice and Havoc flanking him like twin pillars of loyalty, Jaxson found himself thinking back to the beginning. He remembered the red digital clock on the wall of the barracks at Camp Blackwood. That clock had been his universe, a countdown to his own obsolescence, a reminder that every second was being stolen by a system that didn't care if he lived or died. He remembered the way the red glow felt like a brand, marking the hours until he would become a shadow again. He looked down at his wrist. There was no watch there now. He didn't need one to tell him he was alive. The red clock was gone, replaced by the rising and setting of the sun over the mountains. The time that had once been a cage was now a gift. For years he had operated as a ghost, a man who didn't exist in any database, a tool to be used and discarded. But the data dump had done something unexpected for him, too. It had forced him into the light. He had been a star witness in the congressional hearings. He had been the face of a movement. He was Jaxson Thorne, a man with a home, a name, and a future. He wasn't a ghost in the machine. He was the man who had broken it. The climax of his journey wasn't the explosion at the gates or the high-speed chase through the Maryland woods. It was this. It was the quiet moment when Justice plunged into the cold lake water to retrieve a fallen branch, his bark echoing off the hills with a joy that was primal and pure. It was Havoc circling back to nudge Jackson's hand, making sure his human was still there. It was the realization that they weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. Jaxson felt a lump in his throat as he watched Justice shake the water from his coat, a shimmering rainbow of spray erupting in the light. He thought of the thousands of miles they had traveled, the blood they had spilled, and the terror they had weathered together. He thought of the veterans who were currently sleeping better because of the dogs he had saved. He thought of the way his own heart, once a cold, tactical instrument, now beat with a steady, earned peace. He reached out and pulled both dogs into a rough, sprawling embrace on the grassy bank. The smell of wet fur and mountain air filled his lungs. In this moment, the trauma of the past wasn't erased, but it was anchored. It was part of the soil, something that provided the nutrients for the new life he was building. He realized then that the fight wasn't over. It had simply changed shape. He had spent his life fighting for shadows. Now, he would spend the rest of it protecting the light. "We made it," he whispered into the wind, and Justice let out a soft, affirmative huff. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Jaxson looked toward the road that wound its way up from the valley. He knew that his story was becoming part of something much larger. He wasn't just a man with 2 dogs. He was a symbol of a shift in the wind. The world was beginning to understand a truth that Jaxson had known in his bones since the moment he saw Justice's eyes through the kennel bars. It was a truth that would define the next chapter of his life, and perhaps the life of the nation. Courage isn't found in the absence of fear, and it isn't found in the power of a rank or a weapon. It is found in the willingness to stand up when the world tells you to stay down. It is found in the bond that transcends species, the silent promise between a man and a beast that they will not let each other fall. He took one last look at the lake before turning back toward the house, where a warm fire was waiting. He knew that the peace he had found was rare, but it wasn't a secret. It was a message he was ready to carry forward. Because in the end, whether you're walking through the fire of a battlefield or the quiet of a Montana meadow, the principle remains the same. Courage walks on 2 legs and 4. And as long as he had breath in his lungs and the dogs had strength in their strides, they would keep walking together into whatever the morning brought. The ghosts were gone. The man was home. But the mission was only beginning. The silence of the Big Sky country wasn't the deafening vacuum of the tactical world Jaxson Thorne had known for the better part of 2 decades. In the world of high-value targets and midnight extractions, silence had been a predator. A suffocating, heavy void where the ghosts of Kandahar whispered in the dark. It was the sound of a burning compound, the echo of Elias begging for a salvation that Jaxson had traded for a mission objective. That singular choice, made in the sterile cold of tactical necessity, had turned him into a specter. He was a man who walked the earth without a soul, his existence measured only by the cold, glowing numbers of a red digital clock counting down his own obsolescence. He had become a phantom limb of a giant, unfeeling machine, invisible even to himself, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own conscience. But here, on the sprawling, timbered acres of the Sentinel's Rest, the silence was fundamentally different. It had a texture, a weight that grounded him rather than making him drift. It was the whisper of a crisp wind moving through the lodgepole pines, carrying the sharp, nostalgic scent of resin and vanilla. It was the distant, rhythmic rush of a meltwater creek carving through the ancient stone, a sound that felt as old as the earth itself. The mountain air was thin and pure, a sharp contrast to the thick, diesel-choked humidity of his former life. As he sat on the porch, the cool morning air nipped at his skin, clashing beautifully with the rising steam from the ceramic mug in his hands. Underneath his boots, the cedar porch boards felt solid and honest, their slight groans providing a familiar, grounding melody to the start of the day. He watched the deep, steady breathing of 2 massive dogs resting at his feet, their ribs rising and falling in a silent, synchronized prayer of peace. True redemption is never found in erasing the past. It is forged in the fire of choosing to never repeat it. Jaxson looked down at his hands, the scarred, pebbled skin of his palms, holding the steaming mug as if it were a holy relic. These silvered ridges, rough and uneven, were the map of his salvation, the permanent physical receipt of the night he finally chose life over the mission. When the tactical window had collapsed and the extraction bird hovered over the kill zone, the system had demanded he leave justice behind to secure his own future. It was the same cold math that had cost Elias his life 10 years prior. But this time, Jaxson had shattered the equation. He had thrown away the carabiner, abandoned the prospect of a clean slate, and grabbed a white-hot antenna to save a wounded Belgian Malinois trapped in the wreckage. In the agonizing heat of that moment, the ghost of Jaxson Thorne, the asset, the weapon, the phantom, burned away, and the man was finally resurrected. The red clock that had branded his mind with the countdown of a discarded asset was gone, replaced by the endless, golden expanse of a Montana sunrise. He was no longer a shadow of the state. He was a protector of the light. Justice shifted his 75 pounds of solid muscle, resting his heavy, scarred head on Jackson's knee. The dog's coat was a tapestry of survival. Coarse, tan fur peppered with the gray of age and the white lines of old battles. His muscle tone remained impressive, a testament to a life of service. But it was the intensity of his gaze that held Jackson's soul. Justice's eyes were deep amber pools of absolute presence. They didn't look at Jackson's rank or his failures. They looked at his essence. The dog's tail thumped a slow, deliberate rhythm against the cedar porch, a sound of profound contentment. Jaxson ran his thumb over the soft fur behind Justice's remaining ear, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse of the dog's heart. That heartbeat was a miracle. It was the undeniable proof that no soul is ever too far gone to be pulled back from the brink. The dogs had been deemed surplus, broken equipment to be liquidated by a system that only valued utility. Jaxson had been deemed a ghost, a weapon to be pointed and fired until the barrel melted. Together, they had defied the verdict. They had proven that the heart is the only weapon that never jams, the only compass that never loses true north. In your life, what are the red clocks ticking away in the background of your mind? What are the mistakes, the regrets, or the quiet failures that you have allowed to define your worth? We all carry our own versions of Kandahar, those dark places where we feel we lost the best parts of ourselves. We all have moments where we chose the safe path, the sterile objective, and left a piece of our humanity behind in the rubble. Maybe you have been told by the world, or by the harsh, unrelenting voice in your own head, that your best days are behind you, that you are surplus, that you are simply too scarred to matter anymore. You might feel like a ghost in your own home, invisible to those who should see you best. But consider the legacy you are building. Is your life defined by the missions you completed, or by the lives you shielded? At the end of your watch, will you be remembered for your utility or for your capacity to love? The choice between the mission and the man is one we face every day. We often sacrifice the man to serve a mission that doesn't even know our name. But the truth of the human spirit is infinitely more resilient than the judgments of the world. Healing does not require perfection, and redemption does not require a time machine. It simply requires the courage to stand your ground when the next test comes. In your life, who or what is waiting for you to stop running away and finally stand as a protector? Who is waiting for you to see them, and in doing so, finally be seen yourself? There's a profound, quiet grace woven into the fabric of the universe. It is a grace that whispers through the broken places, insisting that every shattered piece can be remade into something stronger and more beautiful. It is the philosophy of the scarred hand and the wounded paw. This grace suggests that we are fully known, every scar, every hidden shame, and yet we are fully loved. To be known by a creature like Justice is to understand a small part of the divine. He doesn't need an explanation for Jackson's past. He simply knows the man who saved him, and that is enough. The divine architect of our lives does not waste our pain. The very fires that scorch our souls are often the exact preparations needed for the missions that truly matter. Jaxson had to carry the suffocating weight of Elias for 10 agonizing years, so that when he looked into the glazed, trusting eyes of a dying dog in a muddy kill zone, he would have the unbearable strength required to finally say, "No more." He had to be broken by the system so he could become the man who dismantled it for the sake of the innocent. The divine does not always speak in the whirlwind or the earthquake. Often, the voice of heaven is found in the stillness that follows the storm, in the quiet realization that you are exactly where you are meant to be. Silence, the soft rustle of dry leaves caught in a mountain eddy. The warmth of the morning sun on a weathered, aging face, a wet nose nudging a trembling, scarred hand, the quiet, long-awaited exhale of a soul coming home. These are the moments where the true battles are won, not in the roaring chaos of gunfire, not in the frantic upload of encrypted secrets, but in the daily, deliberate choice to stay, to love, to protect. Jaxson closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and the rich, familiar smell of canine fur. The heavy leaden pipes that had dragged him down for a decade were gone. He was anchored, not by chains of guilt, but by roots of purpose. He had built this sanctuary for the dogs the world had tried to throw away, but in the process, they had built a sanctuary inside of him. The 12 surplus dogs were safe, their dignity restored. Cinder, the most traumatized of them all, was currently patrolling the northern fence line, his spirit restored by the simple dignity of a job to do and a master who would never leave him behind. As Jaxson looked out across the mirror-like surface of the alpine lake reflecting the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Bridger Range, he knew this peace was not a secret to be hoarded. It was a testament to be shared. There are thousands of unseen heroes out there, walking on 2 legs and 4, who are still trapped behind the wire of their own trauma and neglect. They are the ghosts of our cities and the surplus of our wars. They need advocates. They need voices. They need people who are willing to reach into the darkness and pull them into the light. You have the power to be that bridge by supporting rescue organizations, by advocating for the dignified retirement of military working dogs, and by standing with the veterans who rely on them. You become part of the sanctuary. You can help turn the ghosts of our society back into the heroes they were born to be. Jaxson stood up from the heavy Adirondack chair, his movements unhurried and steady, free from the frantic urgency of his youth. Havoc and Justice rose instantly, flanking him like twin pillars of unbreakable loyalty. The sun began to crest the mountains, flooding the valley with a blinding holy light that made the dew on the grass sparkle like fallen stars. The shadows retreated, chased away by the dawn of a new era. Jaxson Thorne took a deep breath, looking down at the 2 magnificent creatures who had saved his soul. They stepped off the porch together, their feet and paws hitting the earth in unison, moving toward the tree line, ready to face whatever the morning brought. The mission wasn't over. It had simply evolved. True bravery isn't found in the absence of fear, and it isn't defined by the tactical perfection of a sterile objective. It is defined by the unwavering bond between those who refuse to let each other fall. Courage walks on 2 legs and 4. Stories like Jax's don't end here. If you want to see what happened next, and discover more stories that might change how you see everything. Subscribe.